Huge excitement, boys and girls. We are starting a new unit, our second unit of the year. That is on the Cold War. What is the Cold War? Well, we're about to define all of that for you, but this unit is called International Relations, 1943 to 1991, which focuses largely on something known as the Cold War. I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
Okay, so where do we begin? Where do we possibly begin? We've left Russia in 1939. The war has broken out, things have happened, and after the war, we are left with something known as a superpower.
So, a superpower is, as you can imagine, a term used to describe a super powerful country. Okay. Before World War II, there were a number of superpowers: Britain, France, Germany, USA, Japan, and USSR. Generally, the definition of superpower is one whose military is strong enough to be really quite influential. They have a large amount of economic resources, which means that they can project their power, and therefore they are a real key player in international relations.
So what happens in that war that takes a list like Britain, France, Germany, USA, Japan, and USSR and whittles it down? There's a huge clue in the picture of your right. What is that? Sometimes known as a mushroom cloud. And what we know after World War II is this: that Germany and Japan, two of the countries in that previous list, are defeated. Japan was the victim of that mushroom cloud. The United States developed an atomic bomb, the most powerful bomb in 1945 ever created. And it obliterated several cities in Japan with this, and Japan ultimately surrendered. France had been taken over by Germany by 1940. It had been defeated. It had been occupied by the Germans. The Germans had taken a lot of it. Much of it had been destroyed during the war. It was no longer a superpower. Britain had won the war. We know that. We know Britain was on the winning side in World War II. The problem was Britain had spent, over the course of let's say almost 30 years in World War I and World War II, almost every penny it had. There was no more pounds left in the treasury. Britain was victorious, but to win World War II was bankrupt, and it had no more money left.
And what's key to all of this is the fact that these countries are industrially, economically, and militarily broken. They can't fight major wars, they can't project their power onto other powers, and so left over, after all these people have either been bombed to submission, shot to submission, or made broke, or all of them, we have the USA, which has only gotten stronger, and the Soviet Union, which went from runty, almost constantly defeated in 1940 and 1941, to a military superpower, able to produce tons and tons, millions of armed soldiers ready to fight and project their power across.
A nod to the 5-year plan of Joseph Stalin.
Absolutely.
For increasing Soviet industrialization, so that at the end of the Second World War, the alliance, Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union, was made up of two countries that were enormously powerful economically and militarily, and really two countries emerge above all as the most powerful in the world, the superpowers. So these superpowers get involved during this period in what becomes known as a Cold War. And you can judge by that picture, the United States, represented by Uncle Sam, and Russia, represented by the Russian bear, the USSR, are sitting on top of the globe. And these two superpowers will compete for control over much of that globe, as we can see by that very hostile-looking picture. Now, why is it a Cold War? Why isn't it, hot? Bombs exploding create fire. Fire is hot, makes sense. One of the things that characterizes this is that in a hot war, fighting takes place. World War II was a hot war. There was shooting and there was bombing and so on and so forth. In a Cold War, a war is waged using every means except fighting. We're going to talk about how the United States and the USSR are really at war with each other, but they're not bombing each other or killing each other in any great numbers. It really characterizes the frosty, cold atmosphere of tension and threat that the two countries had for each other.
One area where both countries were very active in almost having a sort of silent war was in spying and espionage. Both sides sent spies after spies to each other to learn about military developments, to see hidden weaknesses, to almost foment dissent, not just into each other's countries, but the allies of each each other's countries, or anyone who you could possibly influence to hate your rival. So, for example, Russia would send spies to Latin American countries to make them push communism and therefore rival America, and America would send spies back to try and do that back. And this develops, the technology develops to become even more sophisticated. Satellites, spy planes, for example, the U-2 plane that you can see there, were used to take photos of installations, and also, as you shall see, become, as they are shot down, big issues internationally. MI6, the British equivalent, James Bond, does become part of this and does try and help the US efforts. But as I'm sure, because this is an interest of mine, you'll find out in my lessons, they turn out to be infiltrated and full of communist spies who in turn telling the Soviets what the MI6 are telling the Americans, to the point that throughout the 50s and early 60s, the Americans refused to share any information of MI6 because it's just full of Soviet spies. This obviously increases rivalry on both sides. Yes, there are some spies killed when they land and are found or retrieved, but generally this idea that they're being spied on, being infiltrated, being corrupted, being manipulated behind the scenes by spies just increases paranoia and suspicion on both sides.
Now, make sure you know the nomenclature here. We'll talk about all of these acronyms in this course, okay? CIA, that's the American spy agency. MI6 is the British spy agency. And the KGB is the Soviet USSR spy agency. Now, spy agencies are very much like a secret police, and you'll note that the name was the OGPU, the NKVD, and now the Soviets have changed it again, and their sort of spy agency, their secret police, is known as the KGB. So, another main feature of the Cold War is the issue of propaganda. Now, what you see in the picture is a nod out to me. Mr. Suter has, let's say, lesser interests.
I believe this is the only time that anyone's noticed Canada internationally. Is that correct?
Anyways, what we see is propaganda. Both sides will use propaganda, the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, to create the worst possible image of the other, to ensure public opinion is supported supports the government in its efforts. The USSR used success at sport, for instance, to illustrate the superiority of its system over that of the United States. The United States will use technology and movies and film to promote the United States way of life over the Soviet one. And of course, you see humiliatingly here, the Canadian hockey team, what was considered the greatest in the world, still is, always will be, but nevertheless was unfortunately beaten in the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York by the Russians, but that's all I'll say about that. Anyways, don't forget though that Canada was, and it still is, the most successful country overall. We in fact beat the Ruskies at the last Olympics in a very enjoyable game. It was a 3-1 game. Wasn't as close as it sounded. The Russians had a good goalie. We hit a number of posts, but anyways, moving on.
Were you one of the 4 people who watched it?
in the UK, but you can rest assured that there were 35 million Canadians strong, cheering on every move.
Right, the next thing where we see tension and rivalry is the arms race. Arms is often a shorthand for weapons. So as you can imagine, an arms race is a competition to see who can build the most number and sophisticated and deadly forms of weapons. So in the early years, we see competition in conventional conventional weapons. So the increasing number of tanks, guns, weapons. As Russia, for example, builds more weapons, America gets scared. We need to fight them back. Let's build more weapons just in case there's a war. Russia sees America builds more weapons. We need to build more weapons. Once Russia, as we shall see in 1949, gets their own atomic bomb, this in turn becomes a nuclear arms race. America will build a certain amount of bombs. Russia will feel threatened that America can blow up more cities than Russia, so they'll build more bombs. Then America is now threatened that Russia can blow up more cities. So on, so on, so on. Each side constantly is building new weapons, newer technology than the others, try and beat each other. And this is where the spies split in, because if you can find out what the other guys are doing, obviously you can then deal with it. By 1960, each side had more than enough weapons to destroy each other several times over. And this creates something that we call MAD, or mutually assured destruction. What this basically means is most nuclear bombs are set in either submarines, hidden silos, or on bombers in the middle of the Arctic, which have orders that if there is a nuclear strike, they will automatically fire on the other side. So this means even if America sends the missiles first. There will be and it kills millions of Russians in all the cities. In the secret silos in Siberia, they'll fire the missiles back. This is actually meant to keep peace, and actually this is probably a good thing. If I've got a gun here to Mr. Raine's head and he hasn't got a gun, I can tell him to do what I want, and I can always shoot him in the head. If I have a gun to Mr. Raine's head and Mr. Raine has a gun in the head, we have an interest, both of us, for not shooting each other in the head. So you can argue that although this is not good, and if it went south, it will go very, very badly. Actually, it does mean that both sides have an incentive, a reason not to fire a nuclear bomb, because they know, guaranteed,
Everyone's going
to die. Maybe apart from Canada, because they'll get left out because no one really knows who they are.
And then we'll take over. Another main feature of the Cold War is something known as a space race. We hear stuff about satellites and the International Space Station today, but during the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, there was a competition between the two superpowers on who could spend the most money, who could develop the most satellites, and who could get to space first. And the race for the moon was on. The space race is a really interesting factor of the Cold War. Each side competed for success in space. At first, it was the Russians who were first to launch a satellite. The U.S. were then decided that it needed to be the first to put a man on the moon, which it did. Success in this field was propaganda value, so it had a very, very high propaganda value for both the USA and the Soviet Union.
One final area where there's competition are loans and aid. It becomes very clear after World War II that there's a number of countries which don't necessarily want to pick a side, or if they were going to pick a side, they could go either way, including Britain. Britain has a socialist government and is very broke. They might go neutral, maybe even sympathetic to the communists. How do you get support of someone and get allegiance? You give them loads of loans, inverted commas. Many of these loans are, you don't have to pay us back soon or ever. And what this does is basically gives loads of money to these countries and makes them more sympathetic. In Eastern Europe, the loans come from Russia and get given to these Poland and Hungary, and they get increasingly trapped into the Russian Eastern Bloc, as it shall be called. And in the Western Europe, loads of money, and particularly Britain gets more money than anyone else. We are very broke at this point, bearing in mind. And basically funds the NHS, for example, basically for free. There is some strings attached, but actually a lot of martial aid, as we shall see, is written off. What this is intending to do is buy people's love, or at least buy their semi-loyalty to some extent.
So, another major characteristic of the Cold War is the idea that you have competing political ideologies. The superpower rivalry wasn't new. The Russians and the United States had always generally detested each other. The Russians, as we know, were feared by the West since the Bolshevik Revolution because Western countries generally had a negative opinion of their communist way of life. So at the heart of the rivalry in the Cold War is the conflicting ideologies of the two sides, capitalism and communism. Countries like the United States, Britain, and France, who believed in capitalism, feared the spread of communism and didn't want their countries or their friends to be influenced by this new and dangerous ideology from the Russians in the East. Now, what are the differences between capitalism and communism? Let's walk through them. So in politics, if you were a communist, you believed that there should be only one political party, the Communist Party. There should be no choice, unable to change their government. Okay, the Communist Party will make all decisions on the behalf of the people. In capitalism, in capitalist countries, you have several political parties. Here we have the Tories, we have Labour, we have the no one else cares about the rest. I'm just kidding. I'm a Liberal Democrat. They have the Liberal Democrat. And voters may have a choice. You can vote for the Labour one year, you can vote for the Tories, you can vote for the Liberal Democrats, as you wish. In terms of the economy, things are different as well. In a communist system, there is no private industry. Okay? Think of Stalin hating the kulaks. He didn't want people selling them stuff. There's no private profit. All industry and businesses were owned by the government, by the state, and they were to be used to benefit everyone, and things were, in theory, to be distributed equally. In capitalism, most industry, most business is owned privately. People are free to keep their profits, free to do whatever they want with it, and free to go out of business for trying. The beliefs. There was difference in beliefs. In communism, they believe everyone is equal. They believed in world revolution, that soon enough capitalism would go away. That is, they wanted to encourage communism in other countries. There was also censorship of the media. In other words, they didn't have necessarily notions of freedom of speech in the Soviet Communist East. In the West, the capitalist belief is that some people will be wealthier than others. That's just natural. These people will spread influence to other countries to encourage trade and investment, and they had very little censorship of the media. So even though there's inequality in profit, people are free to do as they please.
So all of this division between communism and capitalism is made worse by what's happening in the 1930s. I mean, even before this, America has had a Red Scare in the 1920s, Britain has had a Red Scare, and basically relations between America and Britain versus Stalin has even got worse. And then Hitler comes along, and he makes no secret of A, he hates communism, B, he hates Russians and Slavs, C, he wants their land for Germans. Okay, so obviously this makes Stalin far more paranoid, and particularly from 1928, where relations go really badly with Britain as well. Stalin does the maths and says a capitalist country of Germany, capitalist country of America, capitalist country of Britain, capitalist of France, and the communist country of Russia. And he fears that there is going to be a division. Now that doesn't quite bear out. In World War II, Germany goes to war with Britain, and France is knocked out, but is fighting Britain. Eventually, Hitler does what is essentially a strange decision many people question, and invades Russia in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, and brings now Russia into the war. So Germany is fighting Russia and Britain. There's a famous phrase, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And very quickly, Britain and Russia, and then when America joins in, Britain, Russia and America start becoming in this alliance against Russia, against Germany even. So we now see this grand alliance. Britain and the capitalist Britain and America and Russia against Germany. It's very important to realize at no point do any of them change their ideology. At no point do any of them change their basic hatred of the idea of each other. But they put it to one side as they have to kick Germany in. And this will be a problem, as we shall see, as when Germany looks like it's going to lose, people start remembering those old hatreds.
Okay, so that's a little overview lesson of some of the key terms of the Cold War and where we stand when this course begins. World War II is on. It's 1943. The Russians are allied themselves with people who believe different things in both Britain and the United States. And we'll see what happens and how this Cold War really kicks off. I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
Take care.